The forests of New England still carry the footprints of a war that nearly erased whole communities and remade a region. A war fought not between distant empires, but across backyards, rivers, and kinship networks. In the spring of 1675, a chain of decisions, grievances, and misunderstandings ignited a conflict so intense that it changed the course of early America. Welcome. If you appreciate clear, thoughtful history, consider subscribing to follow along as we listen closely to voices too often left out of the story. This film will take you into a season of choices and consequences. You will meet people who live daily life on a fragile border, native leaders defending homelands and political authority, English settlers trying to protect towns while navigating unfamiliar laws, and traders, interpreters, and missionaries who found themselves caught between worlds. We will explain the terms you need simply and clearly, who the Wampanoag were, what colonists meant by frontier, why the English used the name King Philip, and how the idea of sovereignty was understood very differently on either side. Why watch? Because this is not merely a tale of battles on a map. It is a story about how a society defines itself when neighbors disagree about land, law, and survival. By tracing cause and effect, we will show how one conflict reshaped property, governance, and memory in ways that still matter today. The man at the center of many English accounts was Metacom, a Wampanoag leader whom colonists called King Philip. That name reveals as much about English expectations as it does about him. To the Wampanoag, leadership was about negotiation, kinship, and responsibility. To the English, a king was a rival to be confronted. Simple words like treaty and rightness carried heavy, different meanings. We will unpack those differences so you can see how misunderstandings mounted. Listen to the landscape: pine ridgelines, tidal rivers, cornfields laid into forest clearings, and villages where houses, wigwams, and meeting places existed in proximity. Imagine a morning when a farmer walks to his fields, a child is sent to stir a pot, a sachem gathers allies. Those ordinary moments were the texture of life and the background against which extraordinary decisions were made. We will begin by exploring the decades before 1675, a time of growing contact, trade, intermarriage, and also mounting legal and cultural pressures. English law was imposed in new courts and town meetings. Native communities faced pressures to adapt to a cash economy and to assert political authority in the face of colonial encroachment. Small disputes over deer, debts, and land title could escalate because the underlying frameworks for resolving them did not align. Next, we will trace the first seasons of open conflict, how local incidents sparked broader alignments, how alliances were formed and broken, and how the war unfolded across a landscape stitched with settlements and villages. We will use maps, personal letters, and court records to follow movements and decisions, not to sensationalize, but to clarify causation and human motive. Along the way, you will meet the people who made choices under pressure: leaders, women who negotiated shelter and sustenance, young men pressed into militia service, and neutral parties who tried to mediate. This film will also look carefully at how historians reconstruct the past. Contemporary accounts often come from English town records or colonial sermons. Native perspectives survive through oral histories and fragmentary accounts. We will explain how historians weigh these different sources and what they reveal about priorities and values on both sides. Whenever we use a contested number or casualty estimate, we will be clear about the range of scholarly views and why certainty is elusive. You will learn about the war's legacies, the dramatic demographic changes, the transformation of land ownership, the legal precedents about sovereignty and captivity, and the cultural memory that followed. Some towns rebuilt and expanded into new patterns of settlement. Some native communities dispersed or were absorbed into other groups, and the way colonists remembered the conflict would shape policy and rhetoric for generations. Throughout, the tone will remain calm and human. We will avoid sensationalism and graphic language while being honest about the suffering and displacement that accompanied the fighting. The emphasis is on understanding why things happened, how people experienced them, and what choices could have been different. In practical terms, expect a narrative that mixes close readings of primary documents, on-site explorations of historic places, interviews with scholars and tribal historians, and clear explanations of technical terms. When we say confederacy, we mean a political alliance among native communities formed to coordinate defense and diplomacy. When we say captivity, we mean the experience of people taken from their homes during raids, later to be held, adopted, or exchanged. We will make these ideas accessible so the story remains rooted in lived experience. By the end of our journey, you will not only know the sequence of events across those fateful years, but you will also appreciate how memory is made, why some stories were amplified in town records, why other stories remained private or were told differently at the fireside, and how both official and personal memories shaped later laws and relationships. Stay with us as we step back into a world of meeting houses and wigwams, of trade routes along rivers, of councils held under oak groves, and of decisions that mattered far beyond any individual settlement. We will listen closely to the letters, court proceedings, and oral traditions that survive, and we will follow the human threads that connect past and present. If you value careful, respectful history, please subscribe so you can follow the full exploration. Now, let us begin at a moment of fragile peace, the uneasy settlement patterns and contested agreements of the years before 1675, and watch how a series of seemingly small choices grew into a conflict that would be remembered very differently by the people who lived through it. Hook plus brief greeting plus soft subscribe. A compact of broken promises, clashing laws, and one death touched off a conflict that would be remembered by few, yet altered the landscape and lives of an entire region. Hello. Thank you for joining this close look at a struggle we often call America's forgotten Civil War. If you find this kind of careful history useful, please consider subscribing for more calm explorations like this. At its heart, the conflict was local and personal as much as it was political. Metacom, the leader often known by the English name King Philip, stood at the center of a web of alliances and pressures. He led the Wampanoag people, who had lived in the coastal lands for generations, while English colonists pressed outward, establishing towns and applying their laws. The result was a collision of different systems of authority and different ideas about land. To say it plainly, two very different ways of living were trying to occupy the same places, and the mechanisms each side used to resolve disputes were not compatible. That disconnect fed resentment. It made small incidents combustible. One of the most consequential sparks was the death of a Christian native man who served as an interpreter and intermediary. His murder, and the subsequent trial that led to the execution of 3 native men, deepened a sense among many Wampanoag that English courts could decide the fate of their people. That sense was not about law alone. It was about dignity, autonomy, and the protection of kin. The colonial authorities saw the executions as enforcement of order. Some native leaders saw them as proof that legal and political power had shifted irrevocably. Tensions grew. So did talk of resistance. This was not a clash between faceless armies. It involved families, villages, and towns, places where people farmed, fished, kept houses, and raised children. Militia units, which were local civilian soldiers mustered from townships, were often the first responders. They were neighbors. And many native groups formed coalitions, sometimes to defend their lands and at other times to pressure colonial authorities into honoring agreements. The tactics combined formal pitched battles with raids on isolated settlements, sieges of fortified villages, and lengthy periods of scarcity and displacement. The landscape itself, rivers, forests, and coastal wetlands, shape how the fighting unfolded. Colonial governments reacted with harsh measures that reflected their fear of a wider breakdown. They called up more militia, coordinated across colony lines, and sought alliances with native groups who opposed Metacom's coalition. Some English towns were destroyed, and others fortified. At the same time, native societies faced starvation, displacement, and the collapse of previous trade and treaty networks. Many leaders who had once negotiated with colonists found themselves navigating a far more dangerous and volatile world. These consequences were not just military, they were social and cultural. Families were uprooted. Traditions were disrupted. Economies that had once balanced coastal trade and seasonal labor now struggled to adapt. To understand why it mattered, we should look closely at the concept sometimes used to describe this war: civil war. Plainly put, a civil war is a conflict primarily among people of a single geopolitical area, neighbors and fellow residents fighting over who governs and how. This conflict fits that description because it was largely centered within one region and pitted people who had shared places for generations, albeit under changing terms, against one another. The phrase civil war emphasizes that this was not simply colonists against a distant people. It was people who had daily contact and interdependence, and whose lives were bound together by trade, marriage, and complicated loyalties. Stories from the front lines illuminate how intertwined the communities had become. In some towns, people of native and English descent had lived as neighbors and even converted to Christianity and adapted English customs. In others, long-standing quarrels over land boundaries and the interpretation of deeds flared into bitter disputes. These local differences mattered. They meant that allegiances were not uniform. Some native nations allied with English forces for reasons of protection or rivalry with other native groups. Some colonists advocated for negotiation while others pushed for complete military action. The result was a patchwork of loyalties and betrayals that made the conflict harder to foresee and easier to escalate. The war also exposed the limits of legal and diplomatic language. Colonial deeds, often written in English, carried assumptions about individual property that differed from the communal understandings held by many native societies. Where colonists expected clear title documented on paper, some native communities understood land use through a web of seasonal rights, stewardship, and kinship responsibilities. When the English insisted on the former, and when courts began to enforce these titles, pressure mounted. That pressure came to matter in daily life, where children played, where families planted corn, and which neighbors claimed access to hunting grounds. Tactical shifts during the conflict taught both sides harsh lessons. Guerrilla-style raids showed how mobility and local knowledge could offset the colonists' numerical and technological advantages. Conversely, the colonists' ability to call on coordinated militias and reinforcements, and to ally with certain native nations, revealed the limits of isolated resistance. Towns adapted. Forts and palisades reappeared. People learned to travel in larger groups. Trade patterns shifted. What had been routine travel routes became dangerous corridors. The ordinary rhythms of commerce and harvest were interrupted for months and longer. The human toll cannot be captured in a single number, and historians continue to debate the precise scale of loss. What is clear is that the social fabric of many native groups was fundamentally altered. Leaders were killed or exiled. Communities that had once shaped the region's life, through trade, governance, and seasonal migration, were displaced or dispersed. Some survivors were captured and sold into servitude away from their homelands. For colonists, the war shook confidence and exposed the fragility of frontier life. Entire settlements were abandoned temporarily. Economies strained under lost labor and ruined stores. Yet the aftermath also brought a new degree of colonial consolidation. Governments rethought defense, legal authority, and their relationships with native neighbors. That consolidation had long-term consequences for how power was exercised in the region. Personal stories anchor these broader changes. A mother who fled a burned farmhouse and later found her children living in a nearby town. A native sachem who had once negotiated peacefully in English courts and now found himself negotiating for survival. A militia commander who had to reconcile the devastation he witnessed with the orders he was given. These are the human fragments that historians piece together to make sense of a conflict that was both local and systemic. Letters, legal records, church accounts, and oral histories together give texture to the narrative, revealing fears, hopes, and the mundane realities of provisioning and shelter. The war's memory is diffused and contested. For many years it was subsumed in founding narratives that emphasized colonial resilience. For native descendants, it was a story of loss and survival. Over time, the event receded from public attention, in part because subsequent events at larger scales reshaped national memory. Yet echoes remain in place names, archaeological traces, and family histories. Contemporary scholarship seeks to recover those voices and to reassess the conflict not merely as a historical episode, but as a formative moment that set patterns for law, land, and power in the nation that followed. Studying this conflict today offers practical lessons about how societies handle cultural difference, legal pluralism, and rapid demographic change. When legal systems that were built for one pattern of life are applied to another without mutual understanding, stress follows. When political leaders respond to fear with blunt force rather than careful negotiation, the costs can be long-lasting. Conversely, where alliances are built on respect and clear communication, even tense situations can be diffused. These are not abstract lessons. They speak directly to modern debates about governance, land use, and the rights of communities who live under multiple legal and cultural claims. As we consider the past, it is useful to keep in view the ordinary means by which people tried to make peace. Treaties were negotiated, sometimes imperfectly, and local leaders attempted to craft compromises that would allow daily life to continue. Trade continued in quieter moments. Intermarriage and shared religious communities created ties that complicated simple narratives of friend and enemy. These quieter threads remind us that history is rarely a single story. It is a weave of competing, overlapping, and sometimes cooperative strands. Thank you for listening to this focused account. If you appreciate deep dives that balance careful scholarship with humane storytelling, please subscribe and follow along. Your attention helps keep these difficult, important stories in dialogue, and it supports thoughtful work that listens to many voices across time. New England before the war. When European settlers arrived on a coast of deep forests and winding rivers, they encountered societies with long histories, woven trade networks, and seasonal patterns of life tuned to the land and sea. Hello. If you find this journey through the past worthwhile, please consider subscribing for more thoughtful explorations. The landscape itself set the stage. Rocky shorelines where the tide pulled and pushed daily, inland glades cleared and tended by people who burned and sowed to encourage particular plants, and rivers that ran like highways for canoes. Those rivers were not empty corridors. They were arteries of communication, commerce, and ceremony. Native communities moved with the seasons, planting corn in cleared plots, fishing in runs of spawning rivers, hunting through winter forests, and gathering shellfish along tidal flats. This was a practiced economy, one informed by generations of observation and care. Political life in these communities was layered and flexible. Power was local and personal, often vested in leaders called sachems, who were recognized for their ability to mediate disputes, organize wartime defense, oversee alliances, and maintain ritual responsibilities. A sachem's authority rested on relationships, kinship ties, trade obligations, and reciprocal obligations to neighboring towns. Confederacies and loose alliances could be formed for trade or protection, and they dissolved or remade themselves as circumstances required. English notions of centralized government were unfamiliar. Leadership could be situational, negotiated, and often collective. Trade had already knit the region to the wider Atlantic world. European goods, metal knives, broadcloth, and glass beads, arrived in exchange for furs, fish, and local knowledge. Wampum, strings, and belts of shell beads functioned as an item of value and as a record-keeping and diplomatic medium. It helped seal agreements, express status, and transmit messages. These exchanges changed local economies. Metal tools altered woodcraft, and cloth altered dress. But material change was never merely economic. It reworked social relations, created dependencies, and led to new forms of diplomacy and dispute. Disease reshaped the human map long before large-scale settlement. Epidemics carried along trade routes and contact zones reduced populations in many communities, leaving gaps in settlement patterns and altering power dynamics between surviving towns. Those losses were not just numerical. They eroded ritual knowledge, weakened political cohesion, and made some towns more vulnerable to pressure. Survivors adapted by consolidating villages, forming new alliances, and finding ways to draw on diminished resources. The demography of the region had become fragile in places, and that fragility would matter. English settlements were themselves diverse. Some were small coastal fishing stations. Others were organized towns with congregational meeting houses at the center, where both worship and civic governance occurred. The Puritan impulse shaped many such towns. Community life was oriented around strict moral codes, a communal concern for piety, and governance that blended religious and civil authority. Institutions like town meetings and governors' councils channeled decision-making, and land was parceled out to households as both a resource and a social marker. Town boundaries, sometimes vague at first, hardened as fields were plowed, fences built, and roads laid down. Law and land were points of friction. Native concepts of land use tended to emphasize seasonal rights, shared access, and stewardship obligations. Who could fish a river at a particular time, where deer were hunted in different seasons, which plots were left to grow wild for wood, and where cornfields were planted each year. Europeans brought deeds, written contracts, and a notion of permanently alienable property, land that could be fully transferred in perpetuity. These differences were more than legal. They were rooted in fundamentally different worldviews about belonging, responsibility, and the human place within a landscape. Misunderstandings grew when written deeds were interpreted as full ownership by colonists, while native sellers often saw transactions as granting use or sharing rather than total dispossession. Missionary work altered social patterns as well. Figures like John Eliot sought to translate Christian scripture into local languages and to settle native converts in so-called praying towns, where new settlers lived under Christian instruction and colonial magistrates often supervised daily life. A praying town was a place where native men, women, and children attempted to live by new religious rules, adopt English agricultural practices, and sometimes submit to colonial courts for governance. For some, this offered protection and material support, especially when neighboring towns faced threats. For others, it eroded traditional practices and created tensions within and between native communities. Economic pressures compounded social change. Colonists cleared forest for crops and pastures and introduced domestic livestock that grazed and trampled native plant communities. That altered habitats for game and for plants used for medicine and food by native people. Where a trail once connected seasonal camps, a fence could now cut movement. Port towns grew as shipping hubs, and a market mentality developed that encouraged expansion and intensified demand for land. Pressure to acquire more acreage was not merely about subsistence. It was also about status, about supplying crews, and about speculation. Diplomacy in the region was practiced in many registers. Formal treaties inscribed with marks or wampum belts, gift-giving to affirm ties, and ceremonial exchanges that reaffirmed mutual obligations. Intermarriage and godparent relationships could bind families across cultural lines. At the same time, English legal institutions increasingly shaped how disputes were adjudicated. Native leaders who turned to colonial courts found themselves operating inside a legal world that prioritized written deeds and different evidentiary rules. Language barriers compounded confusion. Translators were imperfect, and intent could be lost or deliberately reframed. The result was a slow accumulation of grievances, contested boundaries, unpaid debts, and different expectations about the enforcement of agreements. Cultural exchange was also rich and embodied. Colonists learned to plant local crops and to use native methods for survival in a new climate. Native people adopted European tools, harnessed new trade goods for prestige, and sometimes took on new forms of dress. Yet adoption never meant assimilation. Communities retained sacred sites, seasonal rituals, and oral histories that oriented social memory. Ceremony continued to be a source of authority and an instrument for peacemaking. That continuity mattered more than colonial observers often recognized. Security arrangements were flexible. In some instances, native and English communities allied to confront mutual foes. In others, small-scale skirmishes or property disputes flared into longer feuds. Arms and alliances shifted as resources and rivalries did. The experience of past conflicts had already taught local leaders to be wary, and memories of those events informed negotiations. Colonists increasingly expected native leaders to police their own people according to English standards, a demand that strained autonomy and created friction where enforcement clashed with customary practices. By the time the settler population grew substantially, a patchwork of towns had taken hold across the coastline and farther inland. Each town was a node in a broader system of markets, courts, and religious life. Nearby native towns watched, traded, and negotiated. They adapted by consolidating settlements, forming strategic marital ties, or by seeking the protection that came from conversion or alliance. The cumulative effect of changing land use, demographic disruption, legal conflict, and cultural pressure was a region altered in ways both visible and invisible. Stories of particular encounters illustrate how complicated daily life could be. A blacksmith might find profitable work crafting nails for ships while also trading with a neighboring native village for dried fish. A sachem might travel to a coastal town to discuss a disputed boundary and return with gifts and grudging promises. A woman in a praying town could learn to sow English seed varieties while still maintaining secret songs passed down by her grandmother. These ordinary moments of exchange and negotiation reveal that the region's history before the conflict was not a simple story of two societies on a collision course. It was a complex weave of cooperation and competition, of shared knowledge and shattered expectations. This is the scene into which a larger rupture would later come. Forests already trimmed into fields, rivers already coursed by trader and canoe, and communities that had been remapping their lives for decades. The seeds of future confrontation were sown in everyday acts, in deeds signed under misunderstood terms, in fences that cut ancient paths, in laws imposed from afar, and in the slow reconfiguration of economies and alliances. But even as pressures mounted, there remained negotiation, resistance, adaptation, and resilience. People on all sides continued to make choices, practical, moral, and strategic, that reflected their hopes, fears, and responsibilities to family and kin. So the prelude to what some later called a civil war looks less like an inevitable march and more like a crowded stage of actors learning new roles. Some played willingly, some reluctantly, and some resisted entirely. The real history lies in those choices, in the meetings and the markets, in the prayers said in cottages and longhouses, and in the maps drawn in ink and memory. It is a history of land and law, of language and livelihood, and of communities trying to live together under new and often unforgiving terms. Rising tensions and misunderstandings. When European settlers arrived along the coast of southern New England, contact with native communities accelerated into a complicated, often bitter, relationship built on trade, treaties, and daily friction. Hello, thank you for listening. If you enjoy this kind of careful, human story, a quiet subscription helps these narratives reach more ears. Epidemic disease had already thinned many indigenous communities, changing the balance of power long before mass settlement turned permanent. Entire villages that had once been centers of trade and diplomacy no longer existed in the same form, and survivors faced new pressures to adapt. Trade goods became necessities. Metal tools, cloth, and firearms altered local economies and shifted social authority. Men who controlled access to trade items gained prestige, and that shift rippled outward, unsettling older patterns of leadership and reciprocity. Land lay at the heart of the tension, though the disagreement was less about territory on a map than about competing meanings. For many native peoples, land was a living resource, used seasonally, shared, and governed by customs rather than a commodity to be owned outright. English colonists, conversant with deeds and private property, pressed for written sales and permanent boundaries. When colonists recorded a sale, they thought they had erased future claims. Native sellers sometimes understood these transactions as agreements about shared use or as exchanges bound to relationship and ritual, not absolute alienation. Small actions, a cleared field here, a surveying stake there, accumulated into a narrative of loss on one side and security on the other. Economic dependency sharpened that sense of loss. Colonists often extended credit in the form of goods. Repayment came through labor, beaver pelts, or land. As furs grew scarce from overhunting, and as European-style agriculture displaced traditional foodways, native people found themselves indebted and vulnerable to pressure. Merchants and magistrates in colonial towns enforced unfamiliar contract models, and sometimes pressed the courts to secure land that had been used for generations. The courts, built to adjudicate disputes between colonists, increasingly asserted jurisdiction over native defendants and plaintiffs alike. That assertion felt like erasure to many indigenous leaders. Religious conversion added another layer. Missionary efforts created praying communities of native Christians who adopted English forms of worship, dress, and even governance. These towns were meant to be bridges. Instead, they often became margins, places where converted people were both allies and objects of suspicion. Conversion carried social consequences. Those who embraced Christianity sometimes gained protection from colonial authorities but lost status among neighboring indigenous groups. Conversely, colonists grew mistrustful of those they viewed as only nominally converted. Misreading intentions and loyalties became routine. Law and sovereignty collided in daily life. Colonial authorities expected native people to appear before colonial courts, to obey colonial statutes, and, in some cases, to carry documentation or live under restrictions that settlers did not impose on one another. To native leaders, these demands were foreign impositions, a refusal to recognize existing systems of diplomacy and justice. When colonial magistrates punished native people according to English legal codes, those punishments were seen in many native communities not as neutral justice but as an assertion of domination. That sense hardened resentments. Personal incidents amplified structural grievances into combustible stories. When a Christian native who had warned colonial leaders of danger was murdered, the colonial response, a trial and the execution of 3 native men, was viewed through radically different lenses. For colonists, the proceedings were an assertion of law. For many indigenous people, the executions were an affront to their customs and a symbol of an unforgiving foreign authority. The event did not create the tension so much as lay bare the roiling misunderstandings beneath everyday contact. Competition for resources produced more than economic stress. Waterways and hunting grounds were lifelines. Colonists fenced fields and built mills that altered the flow of rivers and the availability of fish. Woodland cleared for English-style agriculture reduced seasons for foraging and the rhythms of mobility that had long structured indigenous life. Men and women who had once passed each other in negotiated space now met along new boundaries, where accusation, and accusation alone, could follow when a trap line crossed an invisible lot line. Small violations that might previously have been settled by ceremony or gift now escalated to court summons because the two legal vocabularies did not overlap. Alliances frayed as well. Tribes and bands had long made shifting partnerships for trade, marriage, and war. Some groups used alliances with colonists as diplomatic tools, buying time or access to goods. But as colonists multiplied, those alliances looked less reciprocal. Expectations that native groups would supply support, guides, scouts, or men for local militias, met with mistrust when colonists later demanded more land or sought to settle strategic sites. Where diplomacy once involved shared feasting and ceremonial exchange, colonial officials frequently reduced those practices to signatures on paper. The loss of ritual channels for dispute resolution left a vacuum that bureaucracy could not fill. Language, too, bent conversations into misunderstandings. Translators worked miracles and committed crimes of omission. A single word rendered differently could harden into a broken promise. Ceremonial gestures meant to convey temporary sharing might be recorded in English as a revocable transfer. Some native leaders recognized that the colonists' world required a kind of verbal finality and tried to adapt. Others resisted, and nearly every transaction carried the risk that two parties were literally talking past one another. That gap grew with generations, because children raised in colonial schools saw the world in legal terms that their elders did not share. Young men on both sides, impatient and shaped by new material cultures, made choices that elders later labeled reckless. Colonial expectations about military readiness and weapons possession added anxiety. Laws that sought to limit indigenous ownership of firearms or restrict their movement were presented as measures of safety. From the native perspective, they felt like disarmament and surveillance. The psychological effect should not be understated. When one side insists on policies that leave the other defenseless, acts of enforcement are interpreted as preparation for offense. Mutual fear thus fed the very possibilities it claimed to prevent. Everyday slights gained symbolic weight. A stolen pig or a dispute over a woman's labor could be rumors that hardened into proof of bad faith. Town meetings and sachem councils watched each other carefully, measuring gestures for threats. The colonists' habit of erecting fortifications, no matter how modest, spoke loudly in indigenous eyes. Likewise, native councils that organized seasonal war patrols or enforced hunting boundaries signaled to colonists that order could be maintained without English law. Each side read the other's acts through the worst possible lens, and trust evaporated. In these conditions, leaders made choices under tremendous pressure. Indigenous sachems weighed whether to resist, to negotiate, or to attempt a middle ground that often satisfied no one. Some allied with colonists, some opposed them, and many tried to keep their people fed and secure in a shifting landscape. Colonial governors and magistrates sought to keep peace and protect settlers, but their instruments were rooted in a worldview that prioritized land titles and written contracts over covenantal relationships. What finally tipped the balance was not a single cause but the accumulation of grievances and misread intentions, each small and explicable yet, in the aggregate, incendiary. When ordinary interactions, sales, arrests, conversions, punishments, were all interpreted as zero-sum moves toward domination, the space for accommodation narrowed. A legal ruling in a Plymouth courtroom could be heard as a challenge to sovereignty 100 miles away. A preacher admonishing a native congregation could be read as an agent of cultural erasure. Little things became big things, and the air filled with suspicion. By the time patience was exhausted on any side, the record showed a patchwork of specific incidents that illuminate the human texture of the conflict. One leader's speech to his council, a colonist's insistence on a deed, a merchant's refusal to extend credit, a magistrate's decision to try a case under colonial law, each played a part. These were not abstract forces but lived realities for people who had to feed their families and protect their kin. At a distance, the story can be reduced to timelines and declarations. Up close, however, the drama of that period is a study in miscommunication and the slow grinding of very different legal and moral worlds against one another. That grinding produced resentment, and resentment hardened into a readiness to fight for what communities saw as existential. The result was not inevitable in the sense of fate, but it became ever more likely as misunderstandings multiplied and opportunities for repair dwindled. Soft-spoken and steady, the record reminds us that conflicts often begin not with grand betrayals but with small accumulations. A misinterpreted gift, a disputed fence, a law enforced with no regard for custom. The story of those rising tensions is a lesson in how quickly social trust can erode when two cultures expect fundamentally different meanings from the same acts. The consequences, once set in motion, proved far-reaching for all the communities who had once shared those shores. Diplomacy fails and violence begins. When European settlers arrived along New England's coast, the everyday rituals that had governed relations between indigenous nations and newcomers began to strain under pressures of land, law, and commerce. Hello, thanks for listening. If you like this journey into the past, please subscribe for more stories told gently and carefully. Medicom, a leader known to the English as King Philip, held a position that combined authority with obligation. The word sachem simply means a chief or leader in many Algonquian-speaking communities. He inherited the responsibility to protect his people's lands, their customs, and the fragile peace that had been stitched together with a mix of gifts, negotiations, and uneasy agreements. That peace relied on a whole web of practices: councils where many voices had to be heard, ceremonial exchanges that confirmed relationships, and ongoing negotiations that adjusted claims about use of land, hunting rights, and access to resources. Colonial diplomacy, by contrast, ran on written deeds, legal titles, and the courts. Settlers expected disputes to be settled in a courtroom and agreements to be documented on paper. These were more than different systems. They were clashing languages. For native leaders, the idea of selling land permanently, that a deed could extinguish a people's right to use an area, was often baffling and sometimes unacceptable. For colonists, the absence of a clear, transferable title created confusion and opened the door to assertive measures. Misunderstandings often began small, with a contested field or a disputed fine, but they could ripple outward into existential threats. Tensions were amplified by a new layer of social change: Christian missions and praying towns. These were settlements where native people who had converted to Christianity lived under the supervision of English ministers and adopted many colonial customs. The name is simple. Praying towns were places intended to encourage native people to embrace Protestant worship and English ways. To many colonists, they embodied hope for assimilation. To many indigenous people, they signaled real divisions within and between communities, and sometimes suspicion that such towns served as instruments of political control rather than spiritual refuge. A single violent event, or at least the perception of one, pushed diplomacy onto a razor's edge. A Christian convert named John Sassamorn served as an interpreter and intermediary between native communities and colonial authorities. His work placed him in a perilous position, trusted by some English officials, yet viewed by others in his own nation with suspicion for his role in mediating with colonists. When he was found dead under circumstances that aroused alarm, accusations landed quickly and fiercely. 3 Wampanoag men were arrested, put on trial in a colonial court, and executed. To many native leaders, the trial represented a profound affront. Their people judged under a foreign legal system, without the communal deliberation and customary processes that had previously governed such questions. That execution was less a solitary spark than a disclosure of simmering resentments. Colonists saw justice as having been served. Many native observers saw a double standard and a refusal to recognize their jurisdiction. Fresh grievances gathered like tinder. When colonial magistrates insisted on handling matters that indigenous leaders believed should be resolved within their own communities, trust eroded. Attempts at negotiation increasingly felt one-sided. Envoys were sent back and forth. Promises were made. But the mechanisms of accountability were not the same on both sides. Where a native council expected public apologies, restitutions in goods, or ritual reconciliation, colonial officials often sought written pledges or the delivery of hostages, people held as guarantees of compliance. The idea of taking hostages, simple in colonial logic, struck many native communities as humiliating and corrosive to sovereignty. Economic pressure deepened the political squeeze. Colonists demanded payments and fines. Debts piled up. Trade could be punitive if creditors used it to force forfeiture of land or resources. In this environment, even small property disputes ballooned into existential arguments. A disagreement over the boundaries of a field or over the ownership of a few acres of timber was not merely local. It touched on whether whole communities could continue to feed themselves, whether hunting territories remain available, whether future generations would be able to live where their ancestors had lived. Several earnest but ultimately failed attempts at diplomacy deserve attention because they reveal how the breakdown happened. Local sachems and colonial magistrates convened meetings, sometimes with interpreters and sometimes with neutral parties from neighboring tribes. Gifts were exchanged in the old style. English officials sometimes presented written guarantees. In one notable pattern, colonists asked for hostages as a form of security. In response, leaders like Metacom tried to placate colonists without yielding the core of their authority. He offered explanations, sent representatives to talks, and used the same forms of negotiation that had kept peace for years. But the colonial appetite for clear, enforceable assurances, backed by muskets and militia, meant that compromise rarely satisfied both sides. Trust eroded when colonial officials used their courts to prosecute native people for crimes committed in contexts where indigenous norms called for different kinds of adjudication. When English juries reached verdicts and sentences, some native communities interpreted the actions as not only punitive but preventive, an attempt to remove leaders or to frighten communities into submission. That perception fed cycles of retaliation and preemptive moves by both sides. Minor skirmishes, thefts of livestock, and arrests that once could have been resolved through a council or a payment instead became incidents that hardened positions. At the same time, alliances shifted. Some native groups sought to mediate, hoping to maintain peace by acting as go-betweens. Others saw the changing balance of power and began to prepare for a more defensive posture. The colonists, feeling besieged in remote settlements and worried about the possibility of coordinated attacks, organized militias and fortified houses. Religious differences entrenched social divisions. Families with mixed heritage found themselves squeezed between loyalty to kin and the legal demands of colonial society. The first assaults that followed were shaped by strategy as much as anger. Attacks often focused on outlying, isolated settlements, places where colonists had expanded into land that had been more recently contested. These strikes were sometimes aimed at compelling a larger political concession, and sometimes meant to punish or deter. They were not indiscriminate but directed toward targets that carried meaning: a garrison, a fortified farmhouse, a place where colonists had recently enforced a contested claim. Those initial actions produced a cascade of responses. Militia units retaliated. Forts were manned. Refugees fled toward towns that were better defended. The conflict, at that point, fed on itself. Each reprisal made new grievances, and those grievances justified further force. A crucial feature of the diplomatic collapse was the mismatch in how each side perceived the stakes. For many indigenous leaders, the central question was survival in a world in which land, resources, and political autonomy were under assault. For many colonists, the central worry was the safety of settlements and the rule of law as articulated by provincial authorities. When each party framed the conflict in these different terms, language itself became an obstacle. Words like treaty, surrender, and ally carried distinct meanings that did not easily translate across cultures. The failure also reflected institutional inertia. Colonial governments had developed procedures for dealing with frontier violence that emphasized arrest, trial, and punitive expedition. Those approaches assumed a monopoly on legitimate force. Indigenous polities governed through consensus and reciprocal responsibility. Leaders who failed to achieve a consensus could lose their authority. When colonial institutions asserted the right to impose penalties and dispossess land without mutual recognition, Indigenous leaders faced an impossible choice: acquiesce and see their communities diminished, or resist and risk destructive warfare. As the first months of fighting unfolded, the human consequences were immediate and widespread. Houses were abandoned. Crops went untended. Trade networks collapsed. The peace settlements and personal relationships that had allowed relatively secure coexistence, marriages across cultural lines, shared labor during harvests, cooperative hunting parties, frayed under new pressures. People on both sides retreated into homelands or fortified villages, and the long work of diplomacy gave way to the raw calculus of survival. There is a clear, sobering lesson in this descent from negotiation to conflict. The breakdown was not the result of a single failure but of cumulative injustices, misreadings, and institutional mismatches. Attempts at diplomacy were real and, for a time, earnest. But they unfolded in an environment where power imbalances and cultural misunderstandings made compromise ever harder. What began as contested claims over land and legal authority quickly became a broader crisis over who would set the rules for life in a changing region. Violence began where diplomacy could no longer reconcile those competing visions. Toward the end, those initial diplomatic attempts are easy to overlook because the scale of the conflict overshadowed them. Yet they matter precisely because they show that the war did not erupt from some inevitable primordial hatred. It was the result of concrete failures, failed councils, misapplied law, and the repeated insistence that one side's system of justice would be imposed on the other. That refusal to recognize parallel systems of authority turned disputes that might otherwise have been settled into sustained warfare. If you want to understand how peace unravels, you can look here, at the moment when words and ceremonies were replaced by warrants and muskets, and when leaders on both sides felt they had no choice left but to prepare for what came next. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated, consider subscribing for more thoughtfully told histories and calm reflections on moments that shape the present. The war spreads across towns and villages. When European settlers pushed beyond the coastal clearings into the tangled woodlands of New England, they encountered a landscape of narrow paths, river corridors, and villages whose lifeways were woven into seasonal rounds. The frontier that emerged was not a hard line. Instead, it was a shifting zone of farms, satellite hamlets, and wooded areas where people met, traded, quarreled, and sometimes turned to war. Hello, thank you for listening. If you find this kind of historical storytelling useful, please subscribe for more calm, careful narratives. The conflict that began as outbreaks in a few places did not unfold like a single-pitched battle between two regular armies. It spread in fits and starts, carried along trails and rivers, and through currents of fear as much as by strategic planning. Small, isolated homesteads were the first to feel the pressure. A family settled a mile from the center of town, tending a field and a few animals, would be vulnerable in a way that the meeting house or the fortified house was not. Those outlying farms were where the war's reach first showed itself. Raids came at dawn or dusk. Some communities lost barns, others lost the ability to plant the next season. Words like garrison or fort had practical meaning then. A garrison was a house or small building reinforced to shelter a group of settlers for protection. In many places, people moved into such structures for safety, leaving fields untilled and fences to fall. Towns that once felt secure found that security evaporated in stages. A raid on a roadside village would ripple outward. A neighbor town would send militia, or not, and rumors would travel faster than scouts. Colonial militias, locally organized men called up to defend their communities, sometimes formed fast and sometimes failed to arrive in time. At the same time, native leaders coordinated networks of support and communication among allied villages, using familiar trails and knowledge of the landscape to move quickly, strike, and melt back into the forest. Where alliances held, raids could be synchronized so that several settlements might be pressured in the same week, multiplying the sense that the war was everywhere. In this way, a conflict that began with localized grievances became a regional emergency, affecting settlements from coastal hamlets to inland farmsteads. Concrete examples show how varied the experience could be from one town to the next. Some settlements saw houses and outbuildings burned and livestock taken, leaving survivors homeless and hungry. Other places witnessed a siege-like tension. Residents gathered into blockhouses or meeting houses that had been adapted for defense, and they endured long, anxious waits for news or reinforcements. In certain towns, people fled to the nearest fortified center, carrying what they could on wagons or on foot. In others, life resumed under a pall of suspicion, because the conflict forced neighbors to make impossible choices about whom to trust. Praying towns, villages of Christianized native people established by missionaries, were caught in a particularly painful middle ground. These communities had adopted many colonial customs and Christianity, yet many colonists still regarded them with suspicion, and some residents were relocated or confined by colonial authorities as the fighting spread. Explanation: a praying town was a place where native people who accepted Christian instruction lived in a sedentary, organized village. They were vulnerable because their identity placed them between two fighting worlds. The pattern of spread was not merely military. Weather and seasons mattered. Rivers that were easy highways in one season could be barriers in another. Winter and early spring made for shortages and increased suffering. Harvest losses from burn fields could turn a short crisis into a deeper humanitarian emergency. Economically, towns were tied together. Mills and smiths, trading posts, and food stores often served a cluster of villages. Once those nodes were threatened, the ripple effects became economic as well as human. Trade slowed, prices rose, and small coastal ports sometimes became overwhelmed as refugees sought safety or supplies. In such conditions, a raid on a single outpost could press on markets and towns far removed from the initial incident. Colonial responses varied from town to town. Some magistrates ordered the construction of blockhouses or palisades. Others called for larger, organized militia expeditions into the countryside. Nearby colonies sometimes negotiated joint expeditions, and in several places native allies joined colonial forces as scouts or guides. The presence of these allies had a profound effect on how campaigns were planned, because they brought local knowledge and different tactical approaches. On the flip side, distrust within communities hardened. Those who had formerly traded across cultural lines now questioned loyalties. A family of mixed household members might find itself suspected by their neighbors. In some instances, entire settlements consolidated. People abandoned distant outlying farms and took shelter within the fortified center of town, changing the human geography of the region for years to come. Communication played a decisive role in the way the war felt as it spread. Couriers on horseback carried warnings. Bells in meeting houses summoned men to muster. But misinformation and rumor also amplified fear. A single unconfirmed report could send neighboring towns into frenzied preparations, emptying fields or prompting preemptive strikes. Sometimes that anxiety led to preventive measures that hardened divisions rather than healing them. The social fabric of New England villages, mutual aid, shared labor, weekly markets, and church life was strained. Sundays, once occasions for routine gatherings, became moments of vulnerability and vigilance. The tactics on both sides adapted to the contested landscape. Native fighters used mobility and knowledge of terrain to strike quickly and then disperse. They targeted supply points, outlying farms, and the weak edges of the colonial network. Colonists learned to respond with mobile patrols, fortified settlements, and the sometimes brutal practice of destroying resources that an enemy might use, what contemporaries would call depriving the enemy of sustenance. This scorched earth approach did not always win hearts and minds. It produced refugees and deepened animosities. In towns that were repeatedly affected, rebuilding meant more than mending houses. It required rethinking how people lived together and how they would defend themselves against future threats. The human cost was measured not only in lives lost but in displacement, shattered livelihoods, and altered daily rhythms. Markets and internal trade shrank. Families who had relied on a season's harvest found next winter looming with scant provisions. Children were apprenticed or relocated for safety. Town records from the period, lists of those who sought relief, petitions to colonial governments, accounts of fortification funds, reflect how communities struggled to keep functioning. Some towns sent representatives to neighboring settlements to ask for help. Others tightened inward, rationing food and consolidating able-bodied men into patrols. The picture that emerges is one of dozens, then scores, of local crises knitting together into a larger, regional emergency. In the aftermath, the map of settlement bore the war's imprint. Some villages were rebuilt where they had been. Others were relocated, sometimes closer to fortified centers or along safer corridors. Colonial authorities revised defense practices and town planning. Wider roads for quicker musters, more centralized storage for grain, and more permanent blockhouses. Native communities likewise re-evaluated their strategies for survival, some dispersing to other regions, others attempting to re-establish livelihoods under changed terms. The memory of those chaotic months lingered in town records, in family stories, and in the way towns arranged their defenses for generations. This was, in short, not a tidy campaign between neat armies. It was a conflict that threaded itself through the everyday life of towns and villages, shifting the daily calculus of safety and survival. The spread of the war exposed the fragility of settlement patterns and the speed with which local incidents could become regional crises. As settlements smoldered in one place, others tightened their defenses. As refugees flowed, markets buckled, and as allegiances shifted, a landscape of uneasy peace and uneasy coexistence took shape. Thank you for listening to this close look at how the fighting reached into the smallest corners of New England life. If you appreciated the story, a soft subscribe helps me continue bringing histories like this into focus. Goodbye for now, and take care. Life, fear, and survival on both sides. Hello. When European settlers arrived in New England, they encountered a landscape shaped by long-standing indigenous lifeways. Families moving seasonally, fields of corn, managed forests, and networks of trade and diplomacy. Life for indigenous communities centered on communal responsibilities, planting, fishing, hunting, and sharing harvests, and authority was often exercised through sachems, who were leaders responsible for diplomacy and the welfare of many families. Settlers built towns with fences, mills, and meeting houses, and their daily life revolved around small-scale farming, local trade, and church obligations. Both societies carried deep knowledge of the land, but they organized survival in different ways. Fear settled quickly into everyday routines on both sides. For colonists, fear meant keeping watch from garrison houses and militias, which were groups of armed local men prepared to defend their towns at short notice. They drilled, kept spare weapons, and stored grain within fortified enclosures. For many indigenous families, fear took the form of hurried councils, decisions to relocate, and the concealment of food stores. Small children learned to move silently. Women learned to pack quickly. Men stood ready to scout or slip away under cover of trees. This was not merely readiness for battle. It was readiness for loss, winter, and the disruption of everything people relied on. Daily survival became a contest of adaptation. Colonists tightened the bonds of community with mutual aid. Neighbors abutted their plows and barns to protect crops. They reinforced palisades around meeting houses. They gathered in fortified houses at night. They depended on militia companies for organized defense. A militia, simply put, was a civilian army drawn from the town, trained to respond to immediate threats rather than professional soldiers. In many towns, women took charge of what might be called the civilian home front. They rationed food, baked in hidden ovens, and tended the sick. They also managed livestock and tried to keep wells and cellars secure against both theft and the elements. Indigenous survival strategies leaned on mobility and deep knowledge of place. Many communities moved between summer planting grounds and winter camps, taking advantage of local resources as seasons changed. They used smoke and the forest canopy for cover, and they understood the river routes that cut inland. Native leaders who coordinated resistance employed hit-and-run tactics, relying on speed and the concealment offered by woods. Alliances with neighboring nations were crucial. A sachem could call on relatives and diplomatic ties to gather men and supplies. Women and elders kept seed corn, dried fish, and other stores that allowed their families to retreat and endure when villages were threatened. The particular experiences of fear can be seen in specific events recorded by survivors. There are colonial accounts of towns surrounded during the night, people waking to the cry of alarm, and the scramble toward the meeting house or garrison. These episodes are described in letters, depositions, and captivity narratives. A captivity narrative is an account by someone taken during a raid that explains their experience in simple, personal terms: where they were held, how they were treated, and what they endured. One famous captivity narrative tells of a woman who was carried from her burning town into the woods and later freed. Such writings became widely read and shaped colonists' fears and resolve. Indigenous oral recollections and later historical interviews record the other side. Families who fled with little more than what they could carry, elders recounting harrowing winters when food became scarce, and the sadness of watching sacred places destroyed. The winter months amplified the struggle for survival. For colonists, cold meant crop failure, fewer days for work, and difficulty in resupplying remote outposts. A town cut off by ice or snow might ration flour and salt and rely on stored salted fish. For indigenous families, winter sheltering often meant consolidating smaller groups into larger winter camps where sharing labor and resources could maintain warmth and diet. Yet winter also offered tactical advantages. Snow muffled movement, which could hide tracks but also reveal them. Frozen rivers could open new avenues for movement, and the shortened daylight forced quicker decisions. Both sides learn hard lessons about timing. A raid in late autumn could mean stripped food stores and a brutal winter for those displaced. Disease and prior epidemics were an unspoken but constant threat shaping survival calculations. Indigenous nations had already suffered population loss from earlier epidemics, which affected leadership structures, hunting capacity, and the ability to sustain long conflicts. Towns also feared contagion and had to balance the danger of disease with the need to shelter refugees. The cross-influence of disease and warfare produced sorrowful choices. Sometimes communities concentrated in fortified places to survive raids, but such concentration could make infectious disease spread more easily. Dispersing could reduce disease risk but leave inhabitants more exposed to attacks. Practical daily adaptations reveal the texture of life under stress. Men on both sides adapted clothing and gear for stealth and endurance. Colonists began to wear more functional garments suited to forest combat, adopting moccasins and loose clothing for quieter movement. Native warriors adapted to European weapons when available, learning the advantages and limits of muskets while still relying on bows, hatchets, and knowledge of ambush. Cooking and food preservation altered. Colonists leaned more heavily on salted meats and hardtack in their garrisons, while indigenous groups rationed dried corn and fish, and sometimes relocated to areas where ice fishing could supplement diets. Children experienced this world intensely. Rooms that had once been for schooling and play became sites for the storage of corn or the sheltering of neighbors. Boys learned to help on watches and were taught how to move quietly. Girls learned more about preserving food and nursing the sick. Education changed too. Ministers sometimes read scripture aloud in refuge houses, but formal schooling often stopped in places under threat. Spiritual life became interwoven with survival. For colonists, sermons interpreted events as trials or divine judgments, motivating communities to persevere. Indigenous spiritual leaders continued ceremonies where possible, but many rituals became more private, practiced in hidden groves to avoid attracting attention. Alliances and betrayals complicated survival. Not all indigenous nations acted as a single bloc. Some sided with the colonists, seeking protection or advantage. These alliances could be pragmatic. A tribe that sided with colonists might receive weapons or provisions but risked becoming a target of other tribes. In several documented cases, Mohegan and other allied groups provided scouts and guides to colonial forces. Conversely, colonial alliances could fracture when settlers distrusted their native allies or when political aims diverged. These shifting loyalties made survival precarious for those caught between factions, especially mixed families or communities with members of differing loyalties. Refuge and displacement were daily realities. Many colonists fled to larger towns or fortified ports, sometimes packing wagons with what they could carry. Some towns sent women, children, and the elderly to coastal cities for safety. Life in refuge was crowded and tense. People shared beds and food. Privacy vanished. For indigenous refugees, displacement often meant moving nearer to supportive kin or seeking shelter with allied nations. The loss of a homestead had deeper implications. A plot of corn left untended could mean hunger the following winter. Land was not merely property. It was the base of nutritional security, cultural practice, and spiritual life, and losing it altered survival strategies fundamentally. Economics shifted under pressure. Trade routes were disrupted. Colonists who had relied on fur trade or coastal commerce found markets closed or dangerous. Credit became scarce. Merchants hoarded or diverted supplies for profit, adding strain. Indigenous economies also adapted. Some communities increased dependence on inland resources. Others turned more to trade with European forts where possible. Without the regular trade, access to European goods, metal tools, firearms, cloth, became uncertain. That scarcity reshaped everyday choices about which resources to risk in trade and which to hoard for emergencies. The psychology of fear created long shadows. Colonists lived with the possibility of a sudden attack, and that led to a culture of readiness but also to suspicion of neighbors who might betray them. Rumor could inflate small incidents into rumors of larger conspiracies. Indigenous communities faced a parallel anxiety, the fear that defeat would mean the loss of autonomy, the end of traditional governance, and forced displacement. Leaders struggled not only to protect lives but to preserve a way of life that included ceremonies, land stewardship, and the teaching of language to the young. Captive-taking was a grim, practical part of survival strategies for both sides, though motivations differed. Captives could be exchanged for hostages, ransomed for goods, or assimilated into other communities. For some indigenous nations, taking captives was a way to replenish numbers depleted by disease and war. For colonists, releasing captives often required negotiated payments or political intervention. The stories of captives often show the complexity of relationships. Some were treated harshly, others sheltered or adopted into new families, and many developed nuanced understandings of their captors' cultures. These human details show survival not only as brute endurance but as adaptation and accommodation under pressure. Leadership choices shaped collective survival. Sachems and colonial magistrates made decisions that could protect or imperil thousands. Some leaders pursued peace talks and negotiated exchanges of prisoners or food. Others opted for punitive expeditions. When a community chose diplomacy, they often secured food or temporary safety. When they chose retaliation, the result could be temporary retribution but lasting cycles of violence. Both forms of decision-making were attempts to secure the lives of kin, not merely to win battles. The role of religion and belief in sustaining people cannot be overstated. For many colonists, sermons and prayer were central to holding a frightened community together. Ministers often organized relief, medical care when possible, and moral support. For indigenous communities, spiritual leaders and the maintenance of ritual practices provided meaning and cohesion even when meetings had to be held in secret. Both traditions offered frameworks to interpret suffering and to motivate endurance. When hostilities wound down, the task of rebuilding and survival took new forms. Towns had to resettle burned plots. Families tried to recover seed corn and rebuild fences. Some indigenous communities faced displacement and the breakup of political structures, while others attempted to reassert land use through treaties or petitions. Those who had lost family members and resources faced long-term poverty and social disruption. Those who had allied with colonists sometimes found themselves rewarded but also under pressure to conform to new political realities. Everyday acts of care kept people alive. The neighbor who shared a loaf, the woman who sewed warm clothes, the elder who taught a child where to find roots in a late winter. These small mercies were as critical as any garrison or ambush. Survival depended on collective habits, on memory and local knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Thank you for listening. If this account held your interest, please consider subscribing for more stories like this, told carefully and calmly. Major turning points and key moments. When Metacom, called King Philip by the English, moved to unite neighboring peoples, the balance in New England tipped toward open warfare, and that single decision would steer events that followed in ways both sudden and irreversible. Hello. Thank you for listening. If this story holds your interest, please consider subscribing for more narratives like this. A spark that lit the tinderbox came far from the battlefields, in a classroom of uneasy trust and suspicion. John Sassamorne, a Christianized native who had learned English and served as an intermediary, warned colonial authorities that trouble was brewing. He was later found dead beneath suspicious circumstances. The trial that followed was a rupture. 3 Wampanoag men were accused, tried by English magistrates, and executed. That legal confrontation did not sit in a vacuum. For many native people it confirmed that English law would not protect them, and for many colonists it seemed proof of a conspiracy. The killing and its aftermath were not merely a local crime. They were a catalyst. Tensions that had simmered for years boiled over, and within months raids struck villages across a wide region. Early raids carried a kind of strategic clarity. Small, mobile bands struck frontier settlements to disrupt supply lines, to force colonists from scattered farms, and to gather food and supplies for the winter ahead. Those attacks showed a tactic: avoid pitched battles with large, well-armed militias, and instead focus on swift blows that sowed terror and stretched colonial defences. In response, English communities, some of which had spent decades bickering among themselves, found that survival required coordination. Local militias that had once guarded only their own towns now cooperated, pooling scouts, stores, and intelligence. That shift toward intercolonial cooperation would shape the course of the conflict. New England settlements, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, began to operate with a shared sense of danger and purpose. One decisive turning point arrived when the colonists turned their attention to the Narragansett people. The Narragansetts had tried to maintain neutrality even as the conflict widened, housing refugees and keeping diplomatic channels open. But colonial leaders feared that a neutral sanctuary could become a haven for fighters and supplies. A large and coordinated expedition of colonists and their allies attacked a Narragansett winter encampment. The engagement was brutal in its consequences. A fortified place that many thought would be safe was shattered, and its people were driven into the landscape, homeless and broken. The assault removed a potential center of resistance and altered the strategic map. It also marked a moral turning point, hardening attitudes and convincing many native groups that neutrality was no longer viable. The loss of that safe space pushed refugee populations into new alliances, and it hardened colonial determination to pursue a decisive end. The winter that followed the assault on the Narragansetts changed the character of the war. Bitter weather, scarcity, and the pressure of displaced people all compounded the desperation on both sides. For the English, who had lost entire frontier settlements, the urgency to subdue resistance intensified. For native communities, the loss of homes and stores meant that mobility and small-scale engagements would become tactics of necessity. During this phase, the conflict was not merely military, it was deeply social and economic. Crops that had once sustained families were gone. Trade networks were disrupted. Alliances shifted as survival instinct reshaped loyalties. In the spring, with thaw and renewed campaigning, the war entered another critical phase. The English offensives broadened and became more systematic. Colonial militias moved beyond defending isolated towns and began to seek out and destroy native encampments. They aimed to break the capacity of the native coalition to wage sustained resistance. At the same time, some native groups adapted their tactics, making use of the land's cover and employing hit-and-run actions that targeted supply wagons, messenger parties, and isolated farmsteads. The war thus transformed into a grinding campaign of attrition. Each side tried to erode the other's will and capacity to continue. A remarkable and often overlooked turning point was the role of so-called praying Indians, native converts to Christianity who had created separate communities under missionary influence. These men, women, and children occupied a painful middle ground. Colonial authorities, suspicious of their loyalties, relocated many of them to internment sites along the coast, places where they were cut off from food and familiar resources during a harsh season. Their suffering revealed the fear that had taken hold in English society: fear of the other, fear of the unknown, fear of infiltration. Some praying Indians volunteered as guides and scouts for colonial militias, while many others languished, innocent bystanders caught in political calculations. Their experience was a moral test for the colonies and a key moment in the fabric of the conflict, because it showed how the war could wound even those who had attempted to bridge cultures. As the fighting progressed, the presence of external native allies shifted the war's momentum. Some native groups sided with the colonists, most notably the Mohegans and the Mohawks. Their motives were complex. Some saw advantage over traditional enemies, others were persuaded by trade ties, and a few hoped that siding with the colonists might protect their own communities. These alliances were tactically decisive. Native warriors who knew the land, the language of ambush, and the diplomatic levers of the region brought skills and intelligence that colonial militias had lacked. Their participation enabled targeted operations that sapped the cohesion of the anti-colonial coalition. When Allied native forces pressed into contested areas, they not only inflicted losses but also delivered the psychological blow of betrayal to those who had hoped for a pan-Indian defense. The hunt for Metacom became the war's culminating drama. He did not fight alone. He had formed a coalition that stretched across multiple groups, tied together by shared urgency. Yet the pressure of sustained colonial campaigns, combined with shortages and betrayals, chipped away at his resources. The pursuit turned more personal over time. Column after column hunted for the man who symbolized resistance. His death, when it finally occurred, was not simply the loss of a leader but a collapse of the central unifying figure who had bound disparate bands into a common purpose. With that collapse came the breakdown of coordinated resistance in many theaters. Small groups continued to resist, to evade, and to contest territory, but without a central figure they found it much harder to sustain long-term operations. The aftermath of his death produced further turning points in how colonial society responded. Colonists seized captives and redistributed land. Others organized militias to mop up remaining pockets of resistance. Those actions consolidated colonial control, reshaped settlement patterns, and opened avenues for expansion that had been blocked for decades. The social reordering went beyond territory. Political authority hardened. Colonial legislatures took measures to prevent future upheavals. At the same time, the war's legacy included the forced removal, enslavement, or relocation of many native people, and the collapse of several tribal communities' political autonomy. Several tactical episodes deserve attention for how they influenced the broader strategy. One involved assaults on small but strategically placed stockades and blockhouses. Colonial militias learned to fortify roads and waterways, making movement more difficult for raids. That defensive adaptation forced native fighters to change their patterns, selecting targets that were less well defended and relying more on stealth than on frontal attacks. Another tactical episode was the colonists' use of punitive sweeps through winter encampments, burning stored corn and scattering supplies. By attacking the material basis of survival, food, shelter, tools, the colonists aimed to produce surrender through deprivation rather than only through battlefield victory. It was a harsh calculus. It worked in the sense that it accelerated dispersal of resistance, but it also entrenched bitterness and trauma that would echo for generations. Not every turning point was military. Legal and political decisions shaped the war's trajectory. The enforcement of English jurisdiction over disputed lands and over legal disputes involving native people changed incentives and made peaceful resolution harder. When courts and magistrates increasingly asserted domain over native affairs, many leaders concluded that accommodation within English systems would require the surrender of core sovereignty. That legal squeeze made armed resistance, tragically, appear as the only route left to defend land and autonomy. Individual stories also illuminated larger shifts. A sachem who once negotiated trade agreements found his diplomacy dismissed by younger English officials. A colonist who had been a trader-turned-militia captain discovered that the friendships built over years were fragile under the stress of raids. A native family separated by internment on the coast saw once stable kinship ties fray under the pressures of displacement. Those microhistories were threads in the fabric of the turning points. They show how the war was not just a sequence of battles but a profound social rupture. As the conflict wound down, patterns of memory and forgetting began to emerge as another kind of turning point. Communities that had suffered erected memorials and told stories of heroism, often simplifying the complex causes into narratives that justified expansion. Native communities, left dispersed and traumatized, carried a different set of memories, of survival, loss, and adaptation. The way the war was remembered shaped political choices that followed, influencing treaties, land sales, and future relations for decades. Memory thus became a field of contestation, as consequential in the long run as the battles themselves. The war also prompted changes in colonial military culture. Local militias developed permanent practices of scouting and rapid mobilization. They codified supply systems and chain-of-command structures that had previously been anno domini hoc. That professionalization of defense changed the balance of power in New England. Settlements that had been vulnerable now had a framework for coordinated response, and that shift facilitated the later expansion of colonial settlement across the region. In practical terms, the war accelerated a transformation from a cluster of loosely connected towns into a region capable of collective military and political action. Finally, the dispersal of native peoples after the conflict marked a turning point in demographic and cultural terms. Families and bands who had lived on ancestral lands for generations were forced to relocate, sometimes into neighboring territories, sometimes into servitude, and sometimes into exile. Those movements altered relationships with neighboring tribes and with the English. New alliances formed, old rivalries were amplified, and the political map of the region was redrawn in ways that made future resistance harder. Throughout the conflict, the interplay of strategic decisions, personal choices, and miscalculations produced moments that swung the war's direction. The murder and trial that ignited violence, the early raids that demonstrated native tactical strengths, the assault on a neutral refuge that eliminated a potential ally, the involvement of other native peoples on both sides, the internment of preying Indians, the systematic English campaigns that targeted supplies and winter encampments, and the pursuit and killing of the leading figure who symbolized resistance. Each of these moments rewove the possibilities available to communities on both sides. They were not inevitable. Each twist emerged from human decisions made under pressure. The story closes not with neat resolution but with consequences that unfolded slowly. Towns rebuilt. Laws were revised. Native survivors adapted in different ways. Some assimilated, some migrated, some held fast to traditions while sheltering what they could. Those outcomes were part of the war's last turning point, the transition from open fighting to a changed society where power, land, and memory had been altered. The echoes of that transition lasted long after muskets fell silent. Thank you for listening to this account of the major turning points and key moments of that conflict. If you found this narrative meaningful, please subscribe for more explorations of the past told with care. Collapse of resistance and shifting power. When the organized resistance at the heart of the conflict faltered, the shockwaves reached far beyond the battlefields and into the daily rhythms of New England life. Hello. If you enjoy thoughtful historical storytelling, please consider subscribing for more calm, careful narratives. The collapse was not a single moment but a series of converging events: the death of key leaders, the loss of supplies, the fracturing of alliances, and the relentless pressure of colonial militias and their native allies. Each of those pieces weakened the ability of indigenous polities to sustain a coordinated campaign, and each contributes to understanding how power shifted decisively toward the English colonists. Leaders matter in conflicts, and the loss of central figures created a vacuum that was difficult to fill. The coalition that had held together diverse groups, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, and others, relied on personal authority and intertribal agreements as much as on military strength. When prominent chiefs were captured or killed, communication and trust frayed. Small bands tried to continue resistance, but without unified strategy they were easier to track and isolate. At the same time, the colonial response grew more organized. Local militias, meaning citizen soldier units raised by towns, became more efficient. They learned the terrain, adapted tactics to irregular warfare, and benefited from allied native groups who opposed the coalition. The result was attrition. The native coalition could not replace losses in manpower or leadership as quickly as colonial forces could. Slow starvation of resources followed. Winter and shortages compounded the military defeats, making sustained resistance increasingly untenable. The term preying Indians refers to native people who had adopted Christianity in mission towns. Many of these communities found themselves in a precarious position, distrusted by both sides and often treated as enemies by local settlers. Removal and internment became common responses. Families were separated. Many were relocated to islands or other confined places under harsh conditions. Such policies were justified by colonists as security measures, but their effect was to break community bonds and to eliminate neutral or supportive constituencies inside colonial borders. Meanwhile, those who remained in the countryside faced capture or forced migration. Some fled to more distant territories. Others sought shelter with neighboring nations. The social fabric of several tribes was torn, leaving elders, women, and children particularly vulnerable. Alliances shifted in unexpected ways. Some Iroquoian groups, wary of a rising power that threatened their own trading relationships with Europeans, chose to side with the colonists or to remain neutral. That decision had immediate tactical implications. Troop movements sometimes included allied native warriors who knew the land and could track small groups. These alliances were pragmatic. They were not endorsements of colonization. Still, they provided colonial militias with capabilities they had earlier lacked. On the diplomatic front, colonial governments moved quickly to translate battlefield success into legal and territorial advantage. Confiscation of land, redistribution of territory to settlers, and formal treaties that curtailed indigenous autonomy created a structural shift. Legal measures, some framed as punitive, others as administrative, made it harder for displaced communities to reassert control over their ancestral lands. The human consequences were long-term. Many who survived the fighting entered a period of dispossession and dispersal. Some were taken as captives to distant islands in the Caribbean and sold into servitude. Others were pressed into servile labor within colonial society. Communities that had been units of kin and culture were scattered. Those who managed to stay intact often did so by adapting to colonial systems, converting to Christianity, entering wage labor, or accepting subordinate legal statuses. Over time, the pattern of power, landholding, political authority, and economic opportunity tilted in favor of the settlers. Town charters were adjusted, old native paths became roads, and places once held as common hunting grounds were parceled out as private property. The transfer was both material and symbolic. Governance shifted from indigenous councils to colonial town meetings and magistrates. The nature of authority changed. Economic pressure intensified the shift. The war was enormously costly for colonists as well as for native communities, yet the colonists sought to recoup expenses by seizing assets and expanding settlements into vacated territories. Agricultural land that had fed generations was quickly claimed and put under European-style fences and plough. Those shifts altered subsistence patterns permanently. Where communal management of resources had prevailed, private ownership and cash-oriented agriculture took hold. Colonial markets expanded, and native peoples who remained were increasingly drawn into those markets on unequal terms. Debt, dependency, and constrained mobility became new realities for many. Cultural consequences must also be part of the story. Oral traditions and leadership structures were disrupted. Youth who might have become future leaders grew up in dislocation. The spiritual life of communities, ceremonies tied to specific places and seasons, was interrupted when those places were lost or made inaccessible. Missionization, too, changed practices. Conversion efforts that had been both voluntary and coercive now had real power to determine survival. Some survivors embraced Christian practices as a route to protection or advantage. Others preserved traditions covertly, passing stories and rituals in new forms. The result was neither total erasure nor simple continuity, but a complicated blending and, often, cultural adaptation under duress. Colonial society itself changed in response to the war's end. Municipal and provincial governments expanded their bureaucracies to manage defense, land disputes, and the resettlement of abandoned towns. The militia model was institutionalized. Taxes increased in many places to pay for fortifications and ongoing patrols. A more militarized civic culture emerged, one that normalized armed readiness and a sharper distinction between civilian life and security. Politically, the war empowered certain leaders who had demonstrated competence, sometimes at the expense of traditional elites who favored negotiation and restraint. That recalibration shaped policy for decades, influencing how colonial authorities would respond to future tensions. Legal and diplomatic practices evolved too. Treaties and deeds formalized what had previously been flexible, negotiated relationships. The courts began adjudicating disputes over titles and boundaries with an English legal framework that native leaders often found alien. Language played a role. English legal terms carried a different conception of land as transferable private property rather than stewardship. Over time, indigenous claims became harder to sustain within this imposed system. Appeals that once might have worked through council negotiation now required navigation of foreign courts and documents. There were exceptions and continuities, however. In some regions, groups remnant, congregating into new settlements or forming alliances with other displaced peoples. Christianized communities that had endured persecution sometimes became centers where language and culture were preserved alongside new religious practices. In a few cases, hybrid communities emerged, where trade networks and kinship ties continued to link people across boundaries. Those pockets of continuity mattered. They would be seeds for later political and social reconfigurations. But they existed within a broader landscape where power had clearly shifted. For a generation, colonial authorities and settlers held the initiative. Memory and narrative were reshaped as well. The conflict was framed in colonial accounts as a decisive defense of civilization, while indigenous memory retained the cost and the grief of dispossession. Stories, songs, and place names carried the memory of what had been lost. Over time, memorialization favored the colonial perspective in public spaces, schools, and official histories. Efforts to preserve indigenous perspectives persisted in families and communities, yet they faced deliberate neglect and erasure in public commemorations. That imbalance in memory reinforced material shifts. When a people's past is sidelined, their present claims are more easily ignored. Finally, practical lessons emerged for both sides. Colonists learned to organize more cohesive local defenses and to form diplomacy with a wider range of native groups. They refined militia tactics and institutionalized early warning systems. Native leaders, where possible, sought new forms of alliance or relocation further afield. Survival strategies multiplied. Some formed satellite communities, others moved into mission towns or joined distant nations as political refugees. The immediate result of the collapse of coordinated resistance was a reordering of the balance of power. The long result was a transformed landscape, legal, economic, cultural, and demographic, whose legacies would shape the region for generations. This was not an abrupt ending to indigenous presence, but it was a decisive moment when the capacity for large-scale organized resistance in the region was broken. The aftermath reconfigured who made decisions, who held land, and who controlled resources. It also altered relationships between peoples in ways that were subtle and profound, evident in law, in memory, and in the everyday patterns of work and worship. The conflict's collapse reshaped a continent in ways that would be felt for many lifetimes. Aftermath, memory, trauma, and rebuilding. The end of the fighting left New England with ruined homesteads, emptied fields, and a population that could not easily account for what it had lost and who it had become. Hello. If you appreciate careful, patient history, please consider subscribing for more work like this. The shock after the campaigns was both visible and invisible, charred foundations and stockades, and the quieter, enduring wounds carried in bodies, households, and stories. Homes and farms lay abandoned in a pattern that read like a map of survival and loss. People who had fled came back to find fences collapsed and cellars filled with rain. Crops that might have fed another season had rotted or gone to waste. In many communities, men who had been defenders did not return, and women and children were left to reckon with how to grow food, mend roofs, and pay debts with far fewer hands. Small towns consolidated. Neighbors combined resources. Town leaders resorted to extraordinary measures to keep local governments functioning. Emergency levies, militia call-ups, and communal work parties to rebuild the most essential structures. There were also legal responses. Petitions for compensation and claims against absent men became routine, and courts were swamped with disputes over land and livestock that had changed hands while owners were away or dead. The native communities suffered losses that were not only material. Entire villages broke apart, and survivors scattered, some into neighboring regions, some into mission settlements, and some into hiding. A notable example is the fate of the Narragansett people after an assault on a fortified winter encampment. Their political structures were badly damaged and their ability to sustain traditional lifeways was deeply disrupted. Another consequence was the forced movement of many captives. Some were relocated within the colonies. Others were sent across the Atlantic to be sold into bondage in places like Bermuda and the Caribbean. That term, sold into bondage, means being treated as someone whose labor and freedom are taken away and transferred for profit to new, distant owners. It is a simple description of a complex and tragic outcome, especially for those families who never saw their kin again. The social fabric of New England altered dramatically. With so many families missing fathers, brothers, and sons, household economies shifted. Women ran farms and businesses in ways that colonial statutes had not primarily envisioned. Children were apprenticed earlier. Town meeting politics, once dominated by a narrow group, opened in some places because there were simply fewer eligible men. At the same time, many native survivors faced policies that stripped them of autonomy. Land surrenders made during or after the conflict were ratified and written into colonial records, accelerating dispossession that had been building for decades. Soldiers and settlers often received land grants on frontier tracts formerly held by indigenous people, creating a material incentive for colonists to maintain and expand settlement at the expense of the original occupants. Memory after the war became a site of contested meaning. Colonial pamphlets, sermons, and public records cast the conflict in providential terms, portraying survival as proof of divine favor and the destruction of enemies as a moral reckoning. Leaders read sermons to assemblies that suggested community survival had a spiritual explanation, and those sermons were printed and circulated. Town historians compiled lists of losses that emphasized martyrdom and sacrifice. These narratives shape how later generations understood the fighting, not simply as a localized war over land and resources, but as an existential test that had been navigated by stout hearts and righteous endeavor. Monuments and commemorations emerged in some places, honoring settler endurance. Streets and place names sometimes memorialized particular battles or leaders of the settler side. This is how public memory often becomes a one-sided mirror. What is glossed over or omitted on that mirror is as revealing as what is reflected. Native recollection followed different paths. Some stories were preserved in oral tradition, songs, family accounts, and place-based narratives that kept alive the memory of loss and resistance. These traditions preserved names of leaders, particular hiding places, and the accounts of those who survived as captives. For decades, and in some instances centuries, such memories circulated within communities rather than in the printed records of the colonies. Where missionary efforts had established Christianized settlements, sometimes called praying towns, those converted communities faced special scrutiny and vulnerability in the aftermath. Some of them were accused of collusion, and residents were sometimes displaced or punished despite their conversion. The irony was bitter. Conversion did not protect people from suspicion, displacement, or dispossession. Psychological trauma, though not framed in the language later used by clinicians, was widely present. Survivors on all sides recounted nightmares, constant fear of renewed attack, and a reluctance to cross certain roads or fields at night. Children who had hidden in cellars or in the woods grew into adults with an instinctive distrust of strangers and an acute awareness of the sounds of distant movement. Generational trauma set patterns of avoidance, storytelling, and ceremonial mourning that reshaped communities. For settlers, public ritual, fasts, sermons, and communal days of remembrance served both to soothe and to narrate a particular meaning of suffering. For indigenous peoples, ceremonies and the telling of family histories preserved grief and memory in ways that could not be absorbed into the colonial narrative of providence. Economic rebuilding took several distinct shapes. In some towns, local elites mobilized capital to encourage resettlement by offering cheap lots or tax relief. Military experience turned into a form of social capital. Men who had led militias often claimed preferential land allocations and prominent civic roles afterward. The colonial economy adjusted with a new emphasis on fortified homesteads, garrison houses, and militia readiness. People expected that frontier life required permanent preparation for conflict. Agricultural practices sometimes shifted as well. Settlers diversified their crops or altered settlement patterns to cluster homes more defensively. Trade routes that had been disrupted reoriented. Ships and town merchants sought new markets, and labor shortages led to increased use of hired help, indentured servitude, and, tragically, the expansion of an enslaved workforce in some places. Legal and political systems consolidated power in ways that reshaped civic life. Emergency measures introduced during wartime often persisted. Colonial governments formalized militia structures, and the authority to raise troops or levy supplies became less anno domini hoc and more institutional. Law courts handled property disputes, claims for lost goods, and the adjudication of captive cases. These legal processes filled volumes and became an archival record of personal misfortune and community recovery. Furthermore, legislation increasingly regulated indigenous presence. Curfews, restrictions on movement, and limits on land sales became commonplace, codifying divisions that had once been more negotiable. The cultural landscape also shifted through narratives that justified settlement and framed the conflict as necessary, though these narratives were not inevitable. Literature, sermons, and court narratives emphasized virtue and resilience among settlers while often depicting native resistance as a tragic byproduct of a different moral order. In contrast, indigenous narratives emphasized betrayal, broken promises, and the need to preserve memory against erasure. Part of the rebuilding of identity for settler communities involved producing histories that validated their claims. And part of the survival strategy for native communities involved safeguarding memories, through place names, oral histories, and the maintenance of kin networks that could outlast colonial record-keeping. Places central to the conflict became palimpsests, landscapes where one layer of meaning was written over another but where traces remained visible. Mount Hope, for example, continued to be a known landmark in the region, associated within many colonial accounts with the leader of the indigenous resistance. Other places, like certain swampy forts or river crossings, retain their reputations as sites of escape or loss. Archaeological work in later centuries revealed foundations, burned layers, and artifacts that confirmed narratives preserved in oral history. These physical traces often provoked renewed interest, sending historians, descendants, and communities into debates over how to interpret what had occurred and what it meant for the present. Commemoration itself evolved. For a long time, mainstream memory muted indigenous perspectives and privileged the settler story. But in more recent generations, scholars and community activists worked to recover suppressed voices. Oral histories were recorded and compared with colonial accounts. Artifacts were re-examined with attention to indigenous technologies and practices, and local commemorations began to include panels or reinterpretations that did not solely celebrate settler endurance. Museums and local historical societies grappled with how to present a more nuanced account, how to acknowledge loss without exploiting it, how to honor suffering without simplifying motives, and how to present both resistance and accommodation as parts of a shared past. One practical consequence of the war that continued to shape life was the transformation of land tenure. Lands once held in community by indigenous families were surveyed, parceled, and sold or granted to veterans and new settlers. These transactions, recorded in colonial deeds, often rested on coerced signatures or on interpretations of land usage that colonists favored. Legal mechanisms, titles, surveys, and court confirmations entrenched new property relations that made restoration of traditional lands extremely difficult. Even when some families managed to retain small parcels, their access to broader hunting, fishing, and gathering territories was curtailed. The consequence was a reordering of subsistence and cultural practices, with long-term effects on community viability. The human stories of rebuilding are often the most compelling. In a seaside town that had been burned, a widow organized a crew to haul stone and rebuild a wharf, slowly re-establishing fishing as a livelihood. In another village, a group of families pooled their seed grain to ensure there would be enough planting the next spring. There were everyday acts of courage and endurance that do not always make it into heroic histories. A schoolteacher who reopened a one-room school with a handful of children, a healer who combined European and indigenous medicines to care for the sick, a craftsman who converted a ruined house into a community meeting place. These acts stitched communities back together, even as the moral and political fabric remained frayed. Religious life was a powerful matrix for processing the aftermath. Congregations held extended periods of fasting and prayer, interpreting the calamity in theological terms while also providing material support for survivors. Ministers compiled lists of the bereaved and organized relief. At the same time, indigenous spiritual leaders performed rituals of mourning and renewal, ceremonies that often took place in secret or in remote locales to avoid colonial attention. Religion, here, served both as a coping mechanism and as a field of contestation. Competing theologies shaped whether communities saw the present as a punitive trial, a call to conversion, or a justification for territorial expansion. Education and the retelling of the episodes mattered, too. For many decades, the dominant schoolbooks presented a tidy narrative: brave pioneers, treacherous enemies, and a lesson about order restoring itself. That narrative influenced generations of children who learned local histories that glossed over complexity. It also contributed to a cultural forgetting that left indigenous voices marginalized in public discourse. Only with the rise of new scholarship and more inclusive public history efforts did textbooks and public commemorations begin to complicate that story, to name the nuances of causation, and to place indigenous actors at the center of the narrative rather than at its margins. The legal aftermath also included trials and punishments that left deep scars. Individuals accused of collaborating with opposing forces faced trials that often rested on shaky evidence. Some were executed, others were enslaved or shipped away. The use of forced labor and the sale of captives to distant colonies altered the demographic patterns in subtle and enduring ways. Communities that once intermarried or traded across cultural lines found those connections severely restricted, and the legal architecture erected after the war reinforced separation. Recovery was therefore not merely a process of physical reconstruction but also of negotiating truth. Civic leaders and citizens had to decide which stories to prioritize and which to suppress. Those decisions influenced land policy, school curricula, and who got to represent the past in public ceremonies. For a long span of time, the dominant memory emphasized settler triumphalism. In recent decades, competing memories gained space. Public markers, anniversary events, and academic reinterpretations began to acknowledge indigenous suffering and resistance. That shift has not erased the power of older narratives, but it has broadened public understanding. Longer term, the war reshaped political relationships. Colonial governments moved toward greater intercolonial cooperation in defense. Military structures that emerged during the fighting were not entirely dismantled afterward. They influenced militia organization for generations. Indigenous political structures, meanwhile, were fractured. Some groups sought alliances with other indigenous nations. Others sought accommodation with colonial governments. The fragmentation made collective political action more difficult and helped open the way for continued settlement and legal rearrangement of territory. There is also an emotional geography to the aftermath that persists. Certain roads, stones, and streams became haunted places in communal memory, sites that people avoided or visited on particular days to recall those who had been lost. That kind of memory work, visiting graves, telling names aloud, maintaining small shrines, sustained communities through decades when official records were one-sided. It also helped preserve the identities of groups that might otherwise have been subsumed. In a sense, rebuilding was never only about putting up houses. It was also about restoring the ability to tell a story about who you were and who you would become. Finally, the war's legacy has continued to provoke reflection about how societies remember trauma and rebuild in its wake. The choices made by communities, how to commemorate loss, how to distribute land, whether to welcome returnees, and how to integrate the stories of all participants into a shared past, remain relevant to contemporary conversations about memory and justice. The unevenness of reconstruction, the persistence of contested narratives, and the endurance of certain communities despite profound losses all offer a complex, often painful, but instructive portrait of what happens after communal violence. This is a history of endurance and of continuing dialogue, with lessons that speak across the centuries to the work of acknowledgement, repair, and the careful stewardship of memory. Closing reflection and legacy. When New England rose from smoke and ruined homesteads, the consequences reached far beyond torn roofs and emptied fields. Hello, and thank you for listening. If you find this story meaningful, please subscribe for more calm explorations of history. The conflict left a reshaped map of power, property, and memory that would steer the region for generations. Colonial authority became more centralized and more militarized. Town militias were reorganized into more permanent forces. Governors and assemblies tightened control over frontier defenses and land titles, and towns that had hitherto managed their own affairs found themselves bound into a tighter web of provincial governance. Small towns that had been safe havens no longer felt secure. The practical lesson was simple and stark. The border between settler town and native homelands could no longer be treated as lightly as it once was. Native nations endured a different sort of transformation. Many communities fractured, some people taken captive, others forced to seek refuge with distant relatives. A number of native prisoners were transported away from New England to work in the Caribbean. Others were confined for months on cold, exposed islands that offered little protection or supplies. Survivors who tried to return home found their fields appropriated, their hunting grounds occupied, and legal claims filed against the very places they had long called theirs. These outcomes were not accidental. They were the ordinary mechanisms of expansion, land transfer through purchase, seizure, and legal maneuvers, that accelerated after the fighting ended. Cultural memory hardened into stories that would last for centuries. Mary Rowlandson's account of her captivity became one of the most read and cited works in the colonies. It shaped how future generations imagined the events and people involved. At the same time, colonial leaders and chroniclers framed the conflict as a test of civilized order against savagery, a narrative that justified harsher policies and helped construct an identity for the English settlers. For native people, oral histories carried different meanings. Stories of loss, resistance, and survival that were less often recorded in print but no less vital for preserving community. Historians have long debated what to call and how to understand the war. Some earlier accounts presented a straightforward story of settlers bravely standing firm against a menacing threat. Later scholarship complicated that telling, showing how competition over land, resources, and differing legal concepts of ownership drove neighbors into conflict. Modern historians have looked closely at primary documents, at captive narratives, at colonial correspondence, and at native testimony where it exists, to argue that the war was as much about dispossession as it was about a single leader's revolt. Those reinterpretations ask us to see the conflict not as an isolated explosion of violence, but as part of a longer process of colonial expansion. Material traces still speak. Archaeologists have uncovered village sites, hearths, and artifacts that bear witness to the lives interrupted by the fighting. Old town ruins, field boundaries, and place names retain echoes of a line drawn and redrawn by conflict. Museums and historical societies show objects and documents that help modern audiences piece together everyday life before and after the war. At the same time, some markers and memorials reflect older narratives, celebrations of colonial endurance or simplistic villainy, that do not capture the full complexity. The legal and social aftershocks were profound. Laws and court decisions that followed reshaped landholding patterns and often favored settler claims. Some native groups were relegated to smaller, less fertile tracts, while others were pushed to migrate or to live within the protection of colonial overseers. New political alliances arose among colonies that had once been suspicious of one another. Emergency cooperation during the conflict created channels for future coordination, including more uniform militia practices and shared intelligence networks. Memory proved uneven. For a long time, the conflict faded from a national story, tucked away as regional tragedy rather than a founding rupture. Yet in local memory it persisted, recounted in sermons, town chronicles, and family stories. The dominant narrative shifted through time. In the 19th century, for example, The war was often invoked in service of national myths about frontier courage and providential destiny. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scholars and communities have pushed back against simplistic readings, emphasizing the voices and experiences of native people, and exposing the ways colonial policies produced lasting dispossession. There is also an enduring lesson about the limits of military solutions to social problems. The war did not create a clear, stable peace that resolved underlying grievances. Instead, it produced patterns, legal, economic, and social, that institutionalized the very inequalities that had helped precipitate the fighting. In practical terms, that meant intensified pressure on native lands, more restrictive legal frameworks for indigenous people, and long-term demographic changes that weaken native political autonomy in the region. Contemporary relevance is immediate. Tribes that trace descent from the communities involved continue to assert identity, sovereignty, and legal rights. Some have pursued federal recognition, while others press for educational reform so that schoolchildren learn more nuanced accounts of the conflict. In towns and cities across the region, conversations about place names, monuments, and commemorations have opened new civic dialogues. Museums and educators increasingly include native perspectives, and a growing number of historians collaborate with descendant communities to ensure that research is respectful and useful. Reckoning requires honesty and humility. A productive remembrance neither romanticizes the colonists nor reduces native peoples to victims. A balanced account acknowledges courage on many sides, recognizes the suffering caused by dispossession and captivity, and appreciates the resilience and continuity of indigenous cultures. When towns revise plaques or when schools redesign curricula, they are doing more than changing words. They are reshaping how future citizens understand authority, rights, and historical justice. Finally, the quiet legacy is one of continuity amid change. People who survived and their descendants adapted, remade families, and passed on traditions. Colonial society went on to expand, grow richer in some places and more stratified in others. Native communities endured, sometimes in new forms and with altered geographies, but often with a stubborn insistence on being remembered. That persistence matters as much as the battles themselves. Thank you for staying with this reflection. If you would like to hear more historical narratives told with care, please subscribe for future episodes. Hello, thank you for staying with me through this story. We began with a single spark, a meeting of cultures strained by land, law, and survival. By the end, that spark became a war that reshaped a region and left echoes that still matter. Here, in the last quiet moments of our journey, let us gather the threads and breathe them back into the shape of meaning. King Philip, Medicom, a leader trying to protect his people's lands and way of life, stood at the center of a conflict born of widening misunderstanding and mounting pressure. Colonists and native peoples had long lived side by side with uneasy agreements. When disputes over land, trade, and authority grew sharper, old compromises collapsed. For readers who may not know the word, sovereignty means the right to govern yourself, a simple idea that, in this story, came into violent collision with competing claims. The war itself unfolded quickly, lasting roughly 1 year, from 1675 to 1676. It moved through forests and towns, negotiated alliances and betrayals, surprise attacks and weary defenses. Native confederacies fought to defend homelands and habits of life. Colonial militias, ordinary settlers who banded together to defend their towns, fought to survive and to reassert control. Alliances shifted. Some native nations sided with colonists, others resisted. By the time the smoke cleared, entire communities had been uprooted, and the map of power in New England was permanently altered. Key points to remember: pressure over land and resources was the root cause. Medicom led a broad and determined resistance. The war was brutal in consequence, though not in spectacle here, and it produced deep and lasting change. Estimates of the human cost vary, but contemporary scholars place deaths, both native and colonial, in the range of several thousand. Whole villages were displaced, social structures were fractured, and many survivors faced forced removal, imprisonment, or enslavement. Those outcomes shaped the next generation's lives and laws. This conflict is sometimes called America's Forgotten Civil War because it was a large, internal conflict fought among peoples who lived in the same region, a kind of civil war before the nation-state we now call the United States had fully formed. The phrase reminds us to look beneath familiar national stories and see the local, painful, and complicated conversations about land, identity, and power that make history what it is. If this narrative felt heavy, know that history asks us to carry the weight, not to be crushed by it. You might be thinking about the people whose names you heard briefly, or about the ordinary choices that led to extraordinary loss. Ask yourself, what parts of this story were new to you? Which details changed the way you think about how communities respond under pressure? Your perspective matters. Share it in the comments so we can learn from each other. If you found this exploration meaningful, please consider subscribing for more carefully told histories. A simple click helps keep this work alive and invites more stories to be told. Tell a friend, leave a reflection, and if there is a question you want answered, write it below. First read what you say, and your curiosity shapes what comes next. Coming soon, we will dive deeper into the aftermath, the legal and cultural consequences that followed the war, the personal stories of survivors and descendants, and a closer look at how memory and place names preserve, hide, or transform this past. We will also explore how archaeology and documents together help us hear voices that had been quieted. As the forest grows quiet and the seasons move on, history does not stay still. It returns in place names, in the bones of old houses, in the laws and memories that shape our lives. Remembering this chapter is not merely an act of looking back, it is a way of listening forward. Thank you for listening.